Today, we're very, very fortunate to have none other than Samuel Moyn of Yale University, of Yale Law School and the Department of History at Yale University joining us. Sam needs no introduction. Obviously, he's essentially the leading figure in the field of the history and theory of human rights today. He's essentially revolutionized our understanding of the history and theory of human rights over the course of the last decade or so with a series of books. In particular, many of you will be familiar with The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History. That is a text that many of us teach and many of us have read in other contexts. Today, he'll be speaking on the relationship between neoliberalism on the one hand and human rights on the other, a sort of tortured, strained relationship that he's been working on for quite some time now. And this is kind of a spin-off from his most recent book, which is going to be published in April. It's coming out from Harvard University Press. It's called Not Enough. So that's it. Without further ado, I hand over the floor to Sam.
Well, thank you for coming, and thanks to Umut for the introduction and for organizing this. It's extremely cold here, for an American at least, but it's really a pleasure to join you. Umut advised me to give a formal talk, so that's what I'm going to do. Blame him if you'd rather have had something a little less stodgy, but I hope to get through it in the time allowed and hear your thoughts on this issue. So I'm going to start in 1981 with this playwright named Zdeněk Tominova, who came to Dublin to give a lecture. She was Czech. She came from communist Czechoslovakia, and she came on a visit to the West. She was the spokeswoman of something called Charter 77. It was one of the first prominent dissident organizations that really made the whole idea of international human rights exciting and activism around those principles famous. Westerners in countries like mine and yours found the whole notion of personal entitlements under global law newly enthralling as a result of figures like this. The United Nations had passed a Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in the 1940s, but only in the 1970s did the document become famous and reorient consciousness and practice. And yet, this dissident, Tominova, explained that she was grateful for the socialist revolution that she had lived through as a child in Czechoslovakia. All of the sudden, she remembered of the leveling of classes that occurred then. I wasn't underprivileged. I could do everything. Now, since then, she explained, terrible things had happened. There had been a Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia to make communism more humane and reform it, but it had been crushed by the Soviets. When she joined the dissident human rights organization Charter 77, Tominova had her head smashed into the pavement when she was beaten by police. And yet she remained true, she explained in this 1981 lecture, to the socialism that had meant so much to her because of what it had meant in her youth. I think that if this world has a future, she explained, it is as a socialist society, which I understand to mean a society where nobody has priorities just because she happens to come from a rich family. And she didn't want this socialism that she still hoped to see would just remain a local ideal in any particular country like hers. She finished, the world of social justice for all people has to come about globally. Now, what was her vision? She didn't want the idea of socialism, as had become the case behind the communist Iron Curtain, to be an alibi to deprive individuals of their basic human rights. But she also didn't want human rights to be an excuse for abandoning a politics of material equality. Now, in retrospect, her speech looks ironic. Look at this data from Google Ngram, which measures how often words and phrases are said in any language we can test over the decades, English in this case. People were once overwhelmingly more likely to utter the word socialism than the phrase human rights in English and every other language that we can test. And yet the one line began to crater or decrease at just the moment Charter 77 was founded. And then the lines of the term's relative popularity crossed right when the Cold War ended, 10 years after Tominova's speech. Now, there are still some socialists, even in my country, that doesn't have them, where there was a presidential candidate who said he was a socialist recently. And yet, in general, I think we can say the lines are revealing. Our era has been one of market fundamentalism. It's as if socialism had never been. And for many of us, in the realm of the ideals we prize most highly, it's as if human rights are all there are. They outline what is required of a just society for many of us today, in the absence of a politics of material equality. Now, actually, there were lots of figures in the 70s and early 80s, like Tominova, who thought there was no contradiction between human rights and material equality. Here's another left-wing Chilean economist, Orlando Letelier, on the far left. Now, in late 1976, he wrote an article in the American magazine The Nation, published just a month before he was killed in the car bomb, you see, by the Chilean authoritarian leader, Augusto Pinochet. Letelier claimed in this article that there was a connection, a hidden one, between the political terror in Chile after its coup and the new free market policies that the coup's instigators were bringing to the country. Letelier had been a minister in Democratic Socialist President Salvador Allende's cabinet. In exile, he claimed that Milton Friedman, the neoliberal economist, and other Chicago boys were in league with the Chilean junta, and that this economic policy that they were bringing to the country was connected to the repression that Pinochet was imposing. Letelier wrote, "Violations of human rights, the system of institutionalized brutality, drastic control and suppression of every form of meaningful dissent is discussed and condemned as a phenomenon only indirectly linked or entirely unrelated to the free market policies that the same junta perpetrating the terror is imposing in the country." But Letelier wanted to link them. There was no way, in the view of this figure, to separate concern for human rights from an attack on the neoliberal source of the violations. Now, 40 years later, long after Letelier's death, that American magazine where he published his article republished it. And your country compatriot, Naomi Klein, wrote the introduction to it and presented new evidence that Pinochet had been involved in Letelier's murder. Now, Klein claimed a somewhat different relationship between human rights as a movement that emerged in the 70s and the neoliberal policies than Letelier himself had asserted. After all, in those 40 years, neoliberalism had gone beyond Chile. It had become a global orthodoxy, especially through international financial institutions that imposed them in other locales through technocratic expertise. Sometimes those policies came through a democratic choice. In her own book, The Shock Doctrine, which you may have read, it's the most popular history of neoliberalism ever written, it wasn't just the fact that free market politics led to human rights disasters. She went further than Letelier did. She claimed that human rights movements were in part to blame for the results because they distracted from this crucial truth. She asserted that human rights ideas and movements impose blinders, in her words, on the relationship between neoliberalism and terror. The human rights movement, Klein argued, helped the Chicago school ideology of free markets escape its first bloody laboratory. How? She discussed Amnesty International, like Charter 77, a renowned early human rights group, and said that its trouble was that it only drew attention to the torture that Pinochet and his aides were perpetrating. It didn't get interested in the deeper causes for the regime's ascent to power or for the policies it pursued. Instead, it just focused through spreading information about the actual wrongdoing against people and especially speech and bodies. It focused on naming and shaming, but not on thinking about why this evil was occurring, which of course she claimed was due to the neoliberal economics that undergirded it. One of Klein's admirers put the general case very strongly, where the effects of neoliberalism begin to bite. Human rights leave unchallenged the conditions in which those abuses become possible. So in this allegation, it's as if decrying the terrors of neoliberalism without mentioning neoliberalism is almost colluding with evil. Now, I think this would have been strange for figures like Letelier and Tominova. They couldn't have anticipated the neoliberal age that was about to come to the world in the 70s. But 40 years on, it does seem pressing to think together about how our age of human rights coincides with one of neoliberalism, to try to figure out what the relationship is with any. After all, it's true that in most nations, welfare states entered crisis and inequality in particular exploded. And globally, especially in international financial institutions, new market-friendly orthodoxies prevailed. Although it's worth mentioning that the globe, if not particular nations, then the globe itself has become more equal in the last 40 years. Human rights have become prominent, our moral lingua franca, in a neoliberal age. They broke out into mass visibility in the 70s when neoliberalism experienced its first breakthroughs. And human rights ascended to something like a consensus public morality at the very time when neoliberalism came to occupy the same status in economic policy. It does seem fair to wonder what we should say about the connection between them. So that's what I want to address, but I want to take a different view of the matter than Klein does, which you might call the collusion or distraction hypothesis that your compatriot offers about the relationship. Because one might ask Naomi Klein, exactly in what sense did human rights as an idea or human rights activism as a movement help neoliberalism make its way? It's true that both of these ideas are based on a moral individualism. They say the individual is what is important in the world. And they both tended to have a suspicion of collectivist projects, notably nationalism and socialism. But it seems false, or at least unsubstantiated, to say that human rights as an idea or a movement played a big role in bringing the neoliberal era about. Further, how could it be the job of human rights activists to save progressives or the left from their own theoretical quandaries or their practical failures? And there have been a lot in our era. I think most important that the cases of Letelier and Tominova suggest strongly that there's no reason that a politics of human rights that looks hardest at more superficial kinds of abuses like torture and disappearances couldn't coexist with a more structural politics that looks at how production and distribution are organized and whether inequality, sometimes massive inequality, is produced as a result. Furthermore, whatever one wants to say about the limitations of human rights, it seems unquestionable that they've brought unprecedented scrutiny in our time, not just to state violence in places like Latin America and around the world, but also the profound failure of states to treat their citizens equally, no matter their gender, race, religion, or sexual orientation. Finally, human rights, alongside this focus on what you might call status equality, also began to call, especially since the end of the Cold War, on resources that were there at the start in the Universal Declaration to press for economic and social rights. Things like entitlements to employment and housing and food. If you look at the other side of the ledger, what neoliberalism has provided for all of its faults, it seems undeniable that what Klein calls disaster capitalism could sometimes fulfill the wildest dreams of human rights law, as in a place like China, where marketization has brought more human beings out of poverty than any other force, certainly including the contemporary human rights movement in world history. Now, none of this, I want to insist, means that we dissociate human rights from their neoliberal era. But I think we have to connect the two in a different way. And I'll suggest that the way we ought to connect them is by indicting the fact that human rights law and movements dropped any ethics or politics of material equality. If they have allowed us to talk about the socioeconomic domain at all, it's only in terms of the most basic subsistence needs of a decent life. And this fact accounts for their limitations in an age of neoliberal inequality. So let me try to convince you of that for the bulk of the lecture and then draw a moral from this argument. So Letellier was on the mark, obviously, when he started with Chile after its 1973 coup. But let's remember it was just one place. There were other places that experienced coups in the same time period, but didn't take a strongly neoliberal turns as a result of dictatorship. Whether Uruguay, this just a couple of months before the Chilean coup, or Argentina a few years later. So political terror of the kind that Pinochet imposed could come on the basis of very different economic policies, and not just in Latin America. More important, much more important, I think, is that in Latin America and beyond, neoliberalism thrived much more after dictatorship fell and democracy came. So neither Brazil, a few years before Chile subject to coup, nor Argentina after 1976 went neoliberal in the economic policies of their politicians until long into the next decade and the transitions to democracies that both experienced. In Argentina, to take just that one case, which is often famously compared with the Chilean one, the first post-transition leader, Raúl Alfonsín on the left, was pretty experimental with respect to distributional justice and economic policy. And it was only the market-friendly Peronist Carlos Menem who took the country down a neoliberal path. And that's a full 15 years later than neoliberalism came to Chile under dictatorship. So no wonder that in the 1970s, even in the face of what was happening in Chile, that an activist like Letellier could believe in the ultimate compatibility of human rights ideals and material fairness, or even global socialism. So I think we have to look beyond Klein's allegation of distraction, at a minimum, to look at this later period and democratic rule. And I want to spend most of my time on Eastern Europe for a few reasons I'll explain. After all, there you had self-styled socialist regimes in power in the later Cold War. When they underwent transition to democracy, it definitely implicated the long-term viability of socialism. More important, throughout the Cold War, human rights there got famously associated not with the critique of right-wing dictatorship, but with the critique of left-wing state socialism itself. And so I think Eastern Europe, not Latin America, is going to provide the key case for thinking about why socialism didn't survive into our times, why material equality died, and whether human rights is to blame. Well, there's so much to cover here, and I'll try to telescope it down to its essence. In Eastern Europe, you saw the rise in connection with human rights politics of a dissident critique of state socialism that had a huge effect on the global left and maybe sapped the viability of the whole idea of a socialist sequel to the critique of the socialist state that human rights implicated. I think if we don't look at this case for that reason, we'll miss maybe the most dramatic evidence for thinking about this connection between human rights and neoliberalism. So what was the dynamic there that we can locate? Surely it's true that human rights as a set of ideals and a set of practical movements in the world, delegitimize state socialism for a lot more people than before in the 20th century. And surely it's also the case that this helps us understand how human rights could become such a central language of justice for our time. That matters because socialism had for so long been the main modern language for material equality. And an era in which human rights are the prime moral language is therefore not going to be one, perhaps, of a socialist left that keeps its eye most of all on the prize of material equality. And the data I show you demonstrates very graphically that this is indeed the case. To the extent people began to dream of human rights and their institutionalization, they stopped dreaming of socialism. But what was the intent of the actors, and what was their understanding of this process, which surely occurred at the beginning of the story? It seems as if it's a different one than one of either collusion or even distraction, that human rights somehow fall prey to the allegation that Klein made. Most of those dissidents in Eastern Europe who deployed the language of human rights to attack state socialism did not believe that there would be a sequel to state socialism. They merely wanted to hollow out space for themselves to enjoy a bit more personal freedom. And so for 2 decades, the critique of state socialism for its oppressions proceeded as if nothing would ever take its place. Almost no one, in fact, could imagine, even into the 80s, that neoliberalism would so quickly do so. Now, that's just to say that dissidents like Václav Havel on the left were not aiming at the result of inequality and neoliberalism that, in fact, came to pass in Eastern Europe after 1989. Most of the dissidents of this era in Eastern Europe adopted an anti-programmatic, apolitical style of engagement. They just stopped talking about contentious topics like how power would be organized, how economic distribution would take place, because they didn't believe that they had room to offer an alternative politics. All they thought the use of human rights was to critique the socialist state as if it would never end. So this seems important because it's as if it prepared them for a certain set of realities, but not for others. Now, it's true, of course, that there were certain socialists, certain dissidents in Eastern Europe who made very explicitly the argument that any version of socialism would necessarily collapse into totalitarianism. As one put it, if we offer any positive socialism of our own, we will just build new bastilles that when we want to bring them down. But most did not make such arguments. To take Havel, just to that one famous Czechoslovak example, his ethics totally lacked positive content. He argued that the less our politics are derived from a concrete and human here and now, and the more they fix their sights on an abstract someday, the more easily they will degenerate into new forms of human enslavement. It's as if he forced himself not to talk about any future on pain of colluding with his totalitarian masters. But of course, that's very different from embracing neoliberalism or a neoliberal sequel to the totalitarian rule that dissidents were surprised themselves to bring down or at least delegitimize. Now, this kind of negative politics in East European dissidents surely did have consequences, but they were only apparent in the 1990s, really quite long after communism fell in 1989. And it wasn't the dissidents mainly who were to blame for the imposition of neoliberalism, even when, as in Havel's case, they were charismatic faces for new policies that conquered the East European region after 1989. There were many neoliberals in Eastern Europe with external friends who imposed neoliberalism under their own power, whether the Freedom Union in Poland or the Alliance of Free Democrats in Hungary or the Civic Democratic Alliance in Czechoslovakia. All of them dropped concerns about class, which were actually quite prevalent in 1989, still, in the name of entrenching markets. Some dissidents, like Havel, had won fame for using the language of human rights and found themselves shockingly commanding the destiny of nations, in spite of the fact that through the Cold War they had denied having any political agenda at all. And yet, it was mainly other politicians, in the Czech case, Václav Klaus, whom you see on the slide there, who had been a central bank functionary under communism, who did the dirty work, you might say. Some of these had leftist paths they had abandoned. A vivid case is the Brazilian intellectual and later President Fernando Cardoso, who had been in the Cold War a Marxian critic of underdevelopment during the dictatorship, and then became an advocate both of human rights and neoliberal reform as a post-reform transition politician. But by and large, I would say, the harshest verdict we can give is that the human rights icons and movements of the Cold War simply weren't attentive to the neoliberal future that came as a transition took place. Even once those, the consequences of neoliberal policies became more and more self-evident. So you might put it the following way. Many of these dissidents had honed a vocation through the human rights movements they'd helped invent of stigmatizing dictatorship. And they were out of position without the right ideals or tools to register the fateful economic developments that, in fact, after transition, set the terms of the future in their country. The results were grim. I don't want to suggest otherwise. And the fact that human rights movements were not focused on them is, I think, a considerable limitation. What were human rights movements doing in the 1990s, notably in a place like Eastern Europe? Well, they were dealing with prior elites and how to either lustrate them in Eastern Europe largely or punish them in a famous Latin American development that later went global. They stood up for fledgling norms of free speech and free association, even as formerly nationalized industries were privatized or, in ex-communist Eastern Europe, sold off in fire sales to future oligarchs. Neoliberal prescriptions were institutionalized through a big and very important alliance of local politicians in many countries and a global elite orthodoxy concentrated in international financial institutions. Human rights was addressing other problems, which its partisans felt at the time were much more important, not focusing on distribution when it counted. These are all considerable criticisms, I think, and point to considerable limitations. What they're not is collusion. And if there was distraction, it seems as if it was a very broadly shared negligence. After all, these things happened without a large amount of criticism from any audience. Okay, lastly, let me mention the international financial institutions before finishing up with some thoughts about what this all means. These international financial institutions, and especially the World Bank, became almost synonymous with neoliberal policy and prescription in the 90s. But when we're honest, it's not as if there was any connection to the idea of human rights in the way they justified them. In fact, just the reverse. Starting in this era with some antecedents, human rights activists began dogging these international financial institutions for their failure to pay any heed to the values and law of human rights, especially economic and social rights. Now, of course, these critiques, led by figures like Philip Alston and others, didn't have much impact. But the point is that it's hard to suggest that the operations of the international financial institutions were somehow abetted by human rights activists who were generally powerless to reorient these institutions. As late as 2006, so just a decade ago, the World Trade Organization's Director General, named Pascal Lamy, who you see on this slide, acknowledged that his organization needed to move beyond the neoliberal Washington consensus to make globalization more humane. But he didn't even mention human rights as the values that would help get this reorientation done. So if we conclude that these international financial institutions working together with local elites have been the main practical agent of the imposition of free market policies around the world, it's hard to conclude that it was because human rights law or movements helped or that they were promoting the values of these institutions. So this is too vulgar, but my basic claim is that neoliberalism is to blame for neoliberalism. It's hard to see that human rights is at fault, but this doesn't mean that we celebrate human rights. In fact, the big question becomes how it could be that the ascendancy of human rights could do so little to disturb neoliberalism as they both ascended in the world in our time. This, I think, is worth considering for a bit. It's true that after the Cold War, many human rights movements rediscovered economic and social rights and strayed beyond the form of activism they'd pioneered in the Cold War, which had focused on speech and the body. But when they did so, it was mainly to tame a globalization that they must have thought could not be more fundamentally altered. And what they argued for is a form of globalization that made room for sufficient provision, the basics of a decent life. They lacked egalitarian norms. There's nothing in the Universal Declaration or any of the human rights movements that follow that speaks of, let alone creates mechanisms for guaranteeing material equality. Although economic and social rights say a lot about sufficient provision. So, to put it very bluntly, human rights was not socialistic. It was not egalitarian. It was merely, if it addressed distribution at all, a politics of minimum sufficiency. And we can talk a bit more about how that worked in the Q&A. But the results were, I think, unsurprising. The socialist idea that had been egalitarian died. Human rights was merely interested in sufficient provision if it addressed distribution at all, and in a sense could coexist more readily with neoliberal priorities than socialism had. Now, this is not to say that the interest in economic and social rights that human rights movements started to evince was very impressive. There was a huge fashion in allocating judges in various national jurisdiction authority to defend economic and social rights for the neediest. But in general, generalizing across the world, those judges proved insignificant agents to the extent they acted in the name of the provisions at all. And worst of all, economic and social rights activism never transcended the expectation that the rights were going to be vindicated country by country, which basically meant they were going to be a discourse about how poor states service their own poor in an unequal world. These are grievous limitations. But I think the deeper issue is that because all they learned to care about distributionally was sufficient provision, human rights movements had no means to recognize, let alone deplore, inequality, which is a very different issue than poverty. After all, as these charts suggest, the basic phenomenon of our time economically is that there are fewer poor, even as the rich get much richer. The most obvious and glaring instance of this is in China, where under so-called neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, more are out of poverty than ever before, at least extreme poverty. But it's also seen, that country, the greatest expansion of inequality of any country over the shortest time period in history. And most other countries tell the same story, just less glaringly. Now, I don't see how we fail to celebrate what one author has called the greatest escape in our time, in the neoliberal era, from the worst poverty and penury. It's an amazing development. That puts neoliberals themselves on the moral high ground, if you like. They can respond that inequality, which has spiked in most national settings, is just the price that we necessarily pay for the result. If you want less poverty, you must embrace more inequality. Now, I doubt many human rights activists accept that grim alleged necessity. It's so self-congratulatory about our choices, especially when so many in every country are still left in grinding penury. But it has to be said that if in their heart of hearts human rights activists have been concerned about the takeoff of inequality in the era their movement has become prestigious, they never talked about it at least until a couple of years ago. So I've argued that the human rights movement fits in its time, a neoliberal time, mainly because it's not an egalitarian movement, even or especially to the extent it pursues sufficient provision in various places. Now, if we believe the populist backlash we're seeing around the world is a result of increasing inequality in various places, especially in a country like mine, the stagnating fortunes of white males of the old industrial classes, we might argue that human rights, which has not been egalitarian, is unprepared for a new era in which it's likely that populist leaders are going to begin to violate human rights norms more and more. Those movements are still playing catch-up. But we might take a different view, returning to Tominova, to Letelier, and wonder what would be the possibility of reviving their vision, which has been betrayed in the 4 decades since they outlined it. Would it be possible to imagine a world in which we had human rights movements, but not at the price of the material equality of which they dreamed and which has been the chief casualty of a neoliberal age? I think that's the debate to have. I would take the position that we need new movements alongside the human rights movements we've learned to have and love. It's not that human rights movements are somehow at fault for inequality and we just have to get rid of them. It's also not the case that human rights movement can learn to take on, alongside their concern for sufficient provision, a global task of arguing for equality materially too. That seems like too much for them to do. But it does seem plausible in the face of the galloping inequality we've been seeing that we could expect the birth of new movements alongside human rights movements, and that those who care about human rights should want those movements to appear. Otherwise, it seems as if those who believe in human rights have to acknowledge that they've been the world historical companions of the explosion of inequality almost everywhere. Human rights activists should not want that to be on their tombstone. They saved some people from barbarism and penury, but only at the price of a massively unequal world as a result. So what should they do? I'm suggesting they should, if you like, make room for a return to the socialist idea. And that also means that young people shouldn't think that they can save the world and make it a better place only through promoting human rights. The idea takes us so far, and if we believe in equality, something else has to take us further. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful, take on all this. Now, life is, of course, a different game than Monopoly, but they have some similarities. So, I mean, there are a lot of ideas in what you said, and I think it would be useful for us to get clear about, what the view is. So, one classic view is that everyone should have something that is often called equality of opportunity, and that if everyone has that, then we need not worry about material equality. Outcomes, like in life, I mean, the whole point of life, the whole point of Monopoly is inequality, because someone's going to win. And if you don't win, then what's the point? So this is a very, very common view. But then we have to get clear about in what equality of opportunity consists. So sometimes when you were talking, it sounded as if you were saying what we should guarantee is a sufficient provision. That if everyone has enough of the good things in life, if they have nothing, obviously they can't play at all. If they have enough food and water and they have a house and so forth, they can, under their own power, get ahead and maybe even win. So that's a view that is closely related to the human rights movement's goals of sufficient provision. Now, the trouble is that that's not really equality of opportunity, because even if everyone should have sufficient provision, a lot of them are still starting from behind, because you and I had a lot more than sufficient provision growing up. And then even for those who, think that equality of opportunity matters, we really have to get into the details of how we know we're equal. I mean, the most radical version, it seems to me, of equality of opportunity would obviously involve the abolition of inheritance. Because how could we possibly argue that equality of opportunity has been realized when rich kids start out like with the whole bank, and then in Monopoly or Life or whatever, we've distributed the few dollars left to the other players. So that's a pretty radical program. Now my own view is that equality of opportunity, even as a kind of matter of moral principle, is probably inadequate. There's a good case to be made that if you lose in the game of life, you might still be entitled to equal standing and some kind of equality of outcomes with your fellow human beings. But even if you disagreed with me there, your principle of equality opportunity is so radical, especially if we globalize it. Now, the fact is that today, almost everything about how you will lead your life is conditioned by a single fact about you, and it's the country in which you're born. We can talk, if others, experts, want to talk about this, about the global equalization we're seeing, but it's really modest. And for as long into the future as we can imagine, like if you could control one fact about your life in advance, it wouldn't be your gender or race. It wouldn't even be your place in the wealth scale of your own country. It would be what country you're born in to begin with, because that's the key determinant of the kind of life you lead. So if you want to take equality of opportunity seriously, it can't just be a local matter. The African child is, et cetera. Okay, but it's a great comment, and I think there's a lot of value in this kind of moral philosophy, thinking about what do we care about? Is it sufficiency? Sufficient provision, I called in the lecture. Is it equality of opportunity? Is it equality of outcomes, et cetera? Great question. Right now, well, but you have a whole life ahead of you to make it possible. Yes.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I guess oh, really? Do I have to? Yeah. Okay. I guess I want to ask you about who these human rights advocates and activists are. It's not my area, but it strikes me that you're taking what I read as an economic determinist view of defining what a human rights activist is.
Okay.
And so I'm curious to go with that thesis and then think about like Chardonnay Marxists and if that's really the problem. And then I'm also curious to challenge you on that thesis and to think about other iterations of neoliberalism that are not necessarily, I mean, maybe they're economic in origin, maybe they're not, but the way they're iterated comes out in different forms of social policy, in the bolstering of other forms of inequality that come from things like colonialism or patriarchy. And how then, if there are differing ways in which we can think about human rights activism, and I would argue that there are, where does that put that economic analysis? And I know you just bid us to not think about the local, but I am very much thinking about, in Canada right now, we have an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, right, and girls. And this is very much an inquiry about inequality. But it's not, it is certainly about economic inequality and material inequality, but it is also about colonial inequality and gendered-based inequality, right?
Great.
So,
okay, those are fantastic thoughts. So I actually see myself as trying to argue, perhaps badly, against economic determinism, because I'm trying to contrast my view with a more faithful Marxist view, faithful to Marx on the Jewish question and the original critique of rights, that thinks of human rights in a very tight relationship with neoliberalism. And I'm trying to loosen the connection and reframe the connection, and also look at least somewhat empirically. I didn't get through a lot in this, brief few minutes, but at the actual actors, primarily in the 70s and 80s, but then into the 90s, that were actually agitating for human rights. Now, of course, that's a vast range of actors, especially as the clock passes. In the 70s, not that many. But as human rights becomes such a prominent idea, many more groups, both new and pre-existing, begin to think of themselves as human rights activists. And in this spirit, we'd have to look at what they're doing. Now, I would be the first to acknowledge that many of these groups are in effect intersecting material inequality, because to the extent they focus on something else, well, the incidence of the violations in which they're interested strongly track inequality. That's the point with which you're ending. And yet, all I would want to insist is that they're not given resources by the Universal Declaration back in the 40s or by the human rights law that's developed both at national levels and internationally to directly talk about inequality. And we might speculate that there are other movements that could. And so that's the suggestion. I'm actually, in relation to some of their harsher critics, trying to get human rights activists off the hook, while also suggesting that they should accept that there are limitations. Now, the strong argument, I think, that you're suggesting against my position is that it may not matter if human rights activists have lacked any direct confrontation of inequality, because what does it matter? If they solve the problem indirectly, they've solved the problem, and it doesn't really matter how they framed it. But the fact is that that's not a plausible view, for the following reason. Just take, distribution. Let's leave aside, free speech and torture and so forth, which themselves may be class correlated. But if we take poverty, we can say that whether under their own power or as a result of other forces, economic and social rights to the most basic things in human life are more honored today than ever before. Fewer people in absolute grinding poverty. But inequality is worse. So how could solving the one indirectly address the other? So that's why I was trying to make the argument that we should come to grips with this really interesting, maybe fundamental phenomenon in our time, that we're doing well dealing with poverty, deprivation when it comes to sufficient provision. We're doing terribly when it comes to inequality.
So I guess just following on that, what I'm wondering then is, are we doing terribly on inequality because rights is something that's formally enshrined, whereas equality, arguably, is something that we perform. And that's why I
Right.
cite the Chardonnay Marxist, right?
Right.
You know, so there's a way in which we can pat ourselves on the back and say, hey, you know, we voted in favor for this law or whatever, but, you know, like, run down the next guy who tries to squeegee my car, you know, at the stoplight, right? Because I don't want these poor people in my face. And, you know, and then to push that beyond the realm of economics to say, well, then could there not also be a layering effect of other forms of inequality? So you've talked a lot about poverty, but I haven't heard you talk about gender or colonialism or
Sure.
sexual expression, gender expression, which, you know, are all things that very much get linked to human rights,
Yeah.
but are also performative equity issues.
Great. No, that's sure. I mean, we could talk a lot about that. I would make just briefly the general case that for all the persisting injustice, what we can call status equality has been a massively successful cause in a neoliberal age. Now, if we think that ultimately people can't enjoy high status unless we deal with class, then we begin to think that that's the source of the persisting injustice. I guess I would argue that, you know, the reason why material inequality, including for those who haven't, you know, are vanilla white males, is such a big casualty for one of three reasons. One possibility is that there's no one who's stood up for material equality. Another is that there are. I think this is what you meant by Chardonnay Marxists, but they're not serious. A third is that they were beaten by more powerful forces. Now, I think all of those three reasons are applicable. They coexist, and then we'd have to decide which of the three is most important. I think it would differ in different countries. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. I really, really enjoyed the talk. So I have two questions. First question, so I really enjoyed the talk, and I have two questions. My first question is about France,
Okay.
which is about turning points in your story,
Yeah.
which is about the elephant in the room, which is capital flight. So you already know what I'm thinking by that. So imagine a universe where Mitterrand wins in 1981, but instead making a sharp U-turn in 1983 after he has tried to nationalize
Sure.
industries, somehow succeeds, or if he doesn't succeed, you know, makes a viable social democratic alternative to neoliberalism. Because one could argue that France is one of the, if not the most important turning points in your story that you have charted. So your thoughts on that. So my second question kind of connects with Dawn's observations. And it makes me think perhaps the hegemonic discursive instrument are not human rights, but fair play and game. Because, again, the title of your book was remarkably evocative, and it makes me think perhaps one of the problems that we face is both that something is not enough, but as well that something is not fast enough. Because here we are squabbling, oh, what has priority, right? So we can pose a problem in definitional terms. Oh, you haven't talked about this and you haven't talked about that. But at the end of the day, we kind of all agree on what the problems are, and we have no problems conceding each other's point. But it seems that we disagree about the urgency of it. And we live in societies that say, hang on a bit. Fair play, due process,
Right.
Take your turn. So some maybe thoughts on the trope of acceleration.
Okay, so I'll try to be briefer this time since we have to ask Uma when we should stop, but it's probably soon.
Probably about 5 minutes.
Okay, so just on the second, I think that's right, and it's probably the case that, you know, if you scratch most human rights activists around the world in the past 40 years, you'd find a social democrat underneath. Not always, but most frequently, and they just didn't prioritize the distributive and once they did, it was a more sufficiency kind of distribution. I think things are changing quite rapidly now because human rights movements, even at the core of the mainstream, are recognizing that they're hostage to big distributional politics. Notably in the United States, where a lot of the premier human rights activism has been based. A figure like George Soros can say, I missed the boat. I funded human rights for decades, but I learned that if I don't do something for inequality in these countries, he's thinking of Hungary, but other places, that the situation will get much worse. No way to defend human rights without a change, at least, in the kind of priorities. Now, your first question is great because, that's a very notable event, of course, when a socialist comes to power precisely when Tominova is speaking and even tries to engage in alliance with the Communist Party and what was called the Union of the Left at the time, and in a classic bout of socialist nationalization. And of course, it didn't work out, and he changed policy. Today, especially, we know that you can't have national socialism with a small n, small s, as was possible back in the 40s. So I think then the question answers itself, that you have to have international socialism. And Thomas Piketty, was widely reviled for this wishful notion that he proposes of a global wealth tax. But of course, it's in that direction that we all have to think. If we want to return to some kind of socialism, we've learned under current economic conditions, at least, it can't be established as an exception in one place because of capital flight, chiefly. Now, what that program would look like is hard to say because, of course, where socialism has ever been institutionalized has been on a national level. And yet, if we conclude that it has to take its own original internationalism much more seriously than ever, we face a daunting set of challenges. Yeah.
Thank you so much for bringing attention to the 1990s as a human rights movement, which has been, I think, a bit not looked at enough, and the story of the Eastern European dissidents. Now I'm wondering what role exactly they play in your explanation, because with the exception of Havel, these dissidents ended up with not a lot of political power, to put it mildly.
Right.
So I think we also need to ask the question of who came in. So I grew up in East Germany, and our experience was we brought down the regime, and then the West swept in. So do we need to think about the certain kind of expansive imperialist tendency of certain parts of, I'm not sure if it's any version of the human rights movement or of capitalism. An interesting remark that somebody made, West German friends many years later, said, back then we couldn't imagine that you wanted to be anything else than to be the way we are. So precisely that sense, and I think that speaks to the question of colonialism, of the failure to imagine that other people have other visions of the good and of the world they want to live in. So the role of those respective actors of East and West in the 90s, I think, is important.
No, it's a wonderful question. Of course, we need to proceed, I think, by looking at each locale. I agree with you entirely that at best, dissidents played the role of charismatic faces of other people's policies, and often they were totally absent by the time something they barely believed was possible took place, namely the fall of communism. So I would want to suggest, as you're suggesting, that their chief role on the stage of history was delegitimizing state socialism. And then we have to ask, well, what was the Western left doing during this period? Because it was allegedly husbanding a democratic socialism through the Cold War. And there was a socialist party, still is, in what was then West Germany, now Germany. And yet, what concessions and mistakes had it made? Even by that point in 1989, to leave it powerless before what happened. So I wouldn't think of it in imperialist terms exactly, because of course there were socialist currents in the West, and in fact that's where socialism, ideologically at least, comes from before globalizing. But all I want to suggest is that that's the problem to solve. What happened to socialism in the left, and the idea that we should blame human rights ideas or activism for the mistakes of that left seems like it's heading in the wrong direction. And it really forces those who are on the progressive left to assume the burden of the mistakes they may have made at a crucial turning point in the 90s, and figure out what they can do from here. I'm operating, not at that grandiose level, but at a much lower level of thinking about the idea of human rights, and suggesting that its trajectory through this period is one that we ought to, in a sense, welcome, for establishing some crucial norms, especially with respect to the authoritarian and totalitarian state, as well as with respect to status equality, but also mark its limitations. That progressives who care about equality materially can't look to human rights in the mode in which it's been established as a set of ideals and as a set of movements. They really are on their own, with the burden on them, a burden they didn't carry at the turning point, but the future beckons, and it's up to them to return to that mistake and see if they can correct it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sam. Sam will have a couple of minutes just to speak with anyone who would like to speak with him as well. But well, I was told in junior high not to say a token of our appreciation, but I don't know what else to say. So it was Carleton University's 75th anniversary last year, so we thought we'd get you a book about that and some goodies, basically. Thank you very much once again.